So, good evening, everybody. Thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Olshaked. I'm the Deputy Director of the Jewish Virtual Library, or JVL, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's webinar. At the JVL, our mission is to provide accurate, accessible, and comprehensive resources on Jewish history, Israel, the Holocaust, and U.S.-Middle East relations. At a time when public discourse is overwhelmed by misinformation and politicized narratives, our work is dedicated to ensuring that facts, history, and context remain available to students, educators, journalists, and the wider public. Tonight, we're honored to hear again from Dr. Mitchell Bard, the Executive Director of the JVL, who will address one of the central challenges in understanding the Arab-Israeli conflict, the prevalence of myths that distorts its history and obscure the realities on the ground. For decades, and of course to this very day, false claims about Israel's origins, its legitimacy, and its policies have spread widely, shaping media coverage, public opinion, and even policy debates. This campaign is further amplified today on social media and perhaps with even more resolve. Drawing on our organization's instrumental book, which I'm sure many of you know, Myths and Facts, A Guide to the Arab-Israeli Conflict, which is, of course, authored by Dr. Bard. Dr. Bard will walk us through some of the most persistent misconceptions surrounding Israel, the Palestinians, borders, refugees, Jerusalem, human rights, and much more. He will clarify how these myths took hold, why they continue to influence conversations worldwide, and what the historical record actually shows. As always, we invite you to submit your questions in the chat, which will be forwarded directly to me, and we'll be more than happy to address them, as many as time allows for, after the conclusion of this presentation. Dr. Bard, the floor is yours.
All righty then. Can everybody see my screen? Or?
I can see your screen, yes.
All right. Well, it's interesting. I'm not sure how many of you know the history of myths and facts, that it was actually first written by the founder of AIPAC back in around 1960. That's how old it is, when there were myths being perpetrated even in the 1950s and 60s. And he started this as a small insert to the Near East Report newsletter and then as a pamphlet. And it gradually grew and grew. I would periodically run into people who said they had the 1975 edition and it was this big, and now it's so much bigger. Why? Well, because the myths just keep growing and growing exponentially, it seems, every year. And just I warn you in advance that I'm not going to be able to go into the kind of detail about the facts that you find in the book Myths and Facts, which is still available through Amazon or on our website. And also, one of the keys to presenting the facts online and in the book is giving you all of the sources and citations so you can see that we are using reliable sources for the information. For this kind of presentation, that's not really possible. So if you have questions about where the information comes from, you'll be able to find it online. When we talk about myths, as you can see from these comments, there's something that has been around forever and have a very serious and often nefarious impact. I particularly like Twain's comment that people who would like to make up facts, then they can distort them. Start with sort of a peculiar one. The book is called The Myths and Facts About the Arab-Israeli Conflict, but the reality is the conflict is over. There really is no Arab-Israeli conflict today, and I'll be doing a webinar about that next year. For years, people would say that it is impossible for Israel to have peace with a Muslim Arab state. And yet now we, of course, see that Israel has it with multiple states. It started with Egypt in 79. This was critical to the entire history of the Middle East because Egypt was the most powerful, largest, most powerful country, the largest country. And once it signed the peace treaty with Israel, that really took the Arab states out of the conflict because no one else had the power to challenge Israel. And there wasn't another war with a state since then. It took 15 years for King Hussein of Jordan to have the courage and wisdom to make peace, but he finally did. Then it took 26 more years before we got to the Abraham Accords. And you had Bahrain, the UAE, uh, the initial signatories. They basically came around to the view that Israelis have had for a long time, which is that the Palestinians had no interest in peace. Up until this time, the Gulf states uh, had the position that they weren't going to move forward with normalizing relations with Israel until there was a Palestinian state. And basically, their interests were being held hostage by the Palestinians. Finally, the Bahrainis, UAE, Morocco, and ultimately Sudan got fed up, said, we're not going to let the Palestinians dictate our interests anymore, and signed the peace agreement. Even now, uh, even though the Saudis refused to normalize relations and join the Abraham Accords when the Crown Prince met with President Trump a few days ago, Israel's had quiet relations with the Saudis for some time. The Saudis are interested in one thing and one thing only, and that's keeping their royal heads connected to their shoulders. And they recognize that Israel contributes to that by its actions to deter and defeat Iran. And so, even though the Saudis are still playing the game and letting the Palestinians veto what could be much more robust relations, there are things that go on under the radar. Two other countries that were at war with Israel technically for decades were Iraq and Libya. But the fall of Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi put an end to that. Those countries now are primarily interested in trying to deal with their own internal divisions, and neither have had any real interest in pursuing the war with Israel. And now, with the fall of Bashar Assad in Syria, there's a good possibility that the conflict with the Syrians will end. There's still problems with various groups within Syria, and there is a certain degree of uncertainty about President al-Shara, given his background as an Islamic militant. But there is a much greater opportunity today than there was 6 months ago, or even anyone imagined a year ago that Israel could have peace with Syria. And in any event, even though Syria technically was at war with Israel under Assad, Syria never went to war again after 1973. Finally, Israel has had no real dispute with the government of Lebanon, but it was at war with Hezbollah, which is, as I'm sure most of you know, a proxy of Iran, which Iran was using to destabilize Lebanon and to pose a constant threat to Israel. Now there is a chance for some normalization with Lebanon, but it really can't go forward until Hezbollah is totally disarmed. And the Lebanese government has said it will do that. It doesn't appear that it can. And so you may have read in the last few days, tensions are heating up, and there's a very good chance within days, if not weeks, Israel and Hezbollah will be in a hot conflict again. Another evergreen myth is that the Jews have no right to the land they call Israel. And the reasons that Israel has the claim goes back thousands of years, millennia, to the ancient Israelites when they first formed governments and kingdoms in the land of Israel. And Jews have been settling the land for centuries, even after the time when Jews were expelled from the land of Israel. There were some who remained behind and continued to settle the land. Another reason that Israel has a claim to the land is that it won parts of the territories in defensive wars. This is necessary to keep those areas to ensure its security against any hostile neighbors. The Jews have been recognized as having a right to homeland in their historic land of Israel through a variety of international agreements. You had the Balfour Declaration in 1917, which was then adopted by the League of Nations, and in the Mandate, which also affirmed the commitment to create a Jewish state in the homeland of the Jewish people. Then you had the UN codify it with the resolution of 1947, the Partition Resolution, establishing a Jewish state. It was given formal legitimacy afterwards when Israel was admitted to the United Nations in 1949. And since then, Israel's become recognized globally by almost every country in the world. And for those who are more religious, of course, there is the Jewish tradition that God promised this land to the patriarch Abraham, and that this is a divine legitimacy, which people who aren't religious don't tend to accept. But you have all of these other political and military justifications for Israel's legitimacy. I'll give you a break from my voice for a couple of minutes. Here's the myth about Zionism and racism.
In 1975, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution slandering Zionism by equating it with racism. It has been used as a charge against Israel's legitimacy ever since. But what is Zionism, and why do people accuse it of being a racist philosophy? The definition of Zionism is actually very simple. It is the national liberation movement of the Jewish people, which holds that Jews, like any other nation, are entitled to a homeland. History has demonstrated the need to ensure Jewish security through a national homeland, but that is not the foundation of Zionism. Zionism recognizes that Jewishness is defined by a shared origin, religion, culture, and history. The Jewish people are a nation, and accordingly have the right of self-determination. The realization of the Zionist dream today is exemplified by nearly 6 million Jews from more than 100 countries who are Israeli citizens. Israel's law of return grants automatic citizenship to Jews, but non-Jews are also eligible to become citizens under naturalization procedures similar to those in other countries. Israel's policy is not unique. Many other countries, including Germany, Greece, Ireland, and Finland, have special categories of people who are entitled to citizenship. Ireland is the country of the Irish people. Irish nationalism is not racism. More than 1 million Muslim and Christian Arabs, Druze, Baha'is, Circassians, and other ethnic groups are also represented in Israel's population, and they have equal rights under the law. Israeli Jews have many different skin colors as well. Zionism does not discriminate against anyone. Israel's open and democratic character and its scrupulous protection of the religious and political rights of Christians and Muslims rebut the charge of exclusivity. By contrast, The Arab states define citizenship strictly by native parentage. It is almost impossible to become a naturalized citizen in Arab states such as Algeria, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait. Several Arab nations have laws that facilitate the naturalization of foreign Arabs with the specific exception of Palestinians. It is ironic that many of the same people who claim that a single state for Jews is racist will strongly defend more than 20 states for Arabs.
Well, the video is a little bit outdated as far as the population goes. Now there's more than 7 million Jews in Israel and more than 2 million Muslims. The other thing I would just say is we have a lot more videos on our YouTube channel that you can check out. Another of the basic myths is that the Israeli-Palestinian dispute is about two people fighting over one land. And this is an almost universal belief, it seems. It's certainly the belief prior to the Trump administration in our State Department and in other foreign affairs departments. But the conflict is much more complicated. For one thing, geography matters. It's not just about the land, it's what particular parts of the land. Where is the water resources? What is the distance between different parts of the land and the strategic implications for those? What is the topography as well as the geography? Where are the population centers? All of those things also matter. Psychology also plays into it. You have a conflict that's been going on for more than 100 years. And so you have on both sides deep emotions of people who have fear, feelings of shame, humiliation, honor. These historical grievances influence how both Israelis and Palestinians see each other, and in terms of how they reconcile the possibility of living together. There's also the historical context. In one respect, you have the fact that Jews have had nations going back centuries. The Palestinians have never, in the entire history of civilization, had a state of their own. There are also two competing nationalisms. You hear this about Zionism being the nationalism of the Jewish people that you just heard about in the video. And there's also a Palestinian nationalism, which also seeks independence for the Palestinian people. What's interesting about the two nationalisms is that Jewish nationalism goes back more than a century, at least to the beginning of political Zionism. And you can go back even further if you want to talk about the biblical connections to the land. Palestinian nationalism, for the most part, only arrived after the '67 war, when the Jews took over the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Prior to 1947, most Palestinians were focused less on getting a state than on unifying Syria. They believed in a greater Syria that they wanted to be a part of, not being part of a Palestinian state. That really is a much more recent development. There was some elements of Palestinian nationalism earlier, but for the most part, it's really a post-67 phenomenon. Most important, I believe, and this is going to be the subject of another webinar, is the religious significance. Religion certainly plays a part from the Jewish perspective of this being the promised land for the Jewish people, but you also have the radical Islamic view that there can be no Jewish state in what they consider the Muslim heartland. And you have fights over holy sites like in Jerusalem, Al-Aqsa Mosque, and other places. But the most important aspect of this is that there are radical Muslims, which Hamas is the best exemplar, who will not accept a Jewish state under any conditions. And that is why the two-state solution is one that cannot be fulfilled so long as you have that kind of extremism. The United Nations partition plan. If you look at the partition, if you can see my mouse, it was a peculiar thing to begin with. It wasn't based on two people and two lands as much as where the two people lived within that one land. So you had the Jewish population concentrated in the blue areas that you can see, and the Arab population concentrated in the green. And this turned out to be a unworkable division of the one land into two places because you had this sort of checkerboard. How did it come about? Well, the British authorities had started out with the two people in one land idea. They had a Peel Commission, which came up with a plan to divide the one land into two states, and the Arabs rejected it. So the British basically threw up their hands and said, we can see that the Jews and Arabs are never going to agree on any kind of division. We're going to turn this over to the United Nations and let them deal with it. The UN established a commission with a number of countries to try to come up with an answer. And what did they decide? Well, let's come up with this two-state solution based, again, not more on demography than on anything else. The Jewish state received more land, but that was mostly made up of the Negev desert. The UN voted on November 29th, 1947 to create the two states. And the Arab states, of course, rejected the partition decision and immediately instigated violence to prevent it from being implemented. Then on May 14th, 1948, when Israel declared its independence, the surrounding Arab states invaded to try to ensure there would not be a two-state solution, only a one-state. What about the refugees? How did the refugees come about? What did the Zionists, the Jews, push them out? Did they try to expel them? Was it ethnic cleansing? Well, a lot of people don't realize that thousands of Palestinians left in 1947 before there was a war. These were people who had the means to go to other countries, usually to other Arab states, and to basically, hopefully, wait out the war. Then you had the case of Arab leaders who encouraged the Palestinians to leave. They promised they were going to drive the Jews into the sea. The Palestinians could then come back. They would get not only their homes, but they would be able to claim the property of that of the Jews. One of the other things that you don't hear people talk about when they discuss the refugees and they discuss the War of 48 is that when the Arab states invaded, they had no interest in creating a Palestinian state. That was never their intention. They wanted to basically carve up Palestine for themselves. And that's essentially what they ended up doing with the Jordanians capturing East Jerusalem and what we now call the West Bank, and the Egyptians occupying the Gaza Strip. Most of the Palestinians who left did it for a simple reason, the same reason refugees are created all over the world, and that is to get out of the way of the fighting. They didn't want to be caught in the crossfire. They simply moved, not very far in distance usually, to other Arab states where they were not alien people. They had shared language, shared culture, shared religion, and they were fully expecting that they'd be able to return after the Arab states conquered Israel. Some of them also left because they were afraid, and they'd been told by their Arab leaders that the Jews were massacring Palestinians. There were a couple of cases where there were large numbers of killings of civilians, but there was nothing like the kind of massacres that usually you hear about in the propaganda. The most famous one is Deir Yassin, which was a case where there were about 100 Palestinians who were killed. Some of them were civilians, some were disguised as civilians. You can read more details about that in the Jewish Virtual Library. Just an example of one quote from an Arab refugee that was similar to a lot of what they heard from their leaders. What was the Israeli position on the refugees? Well, at the beginning, the Declaration of Independence made clear that Israel was prepared to accept whatever Arabs were willing to stay and live in peace with the people of the state of Israel. They were granted full and equal citizenship from the outset. During the conflict, there were many instances where the Jews tried to prevent the Arabs or convince them not to leave. The most dramatic case was in Haifa, where there were about 25,000 Arabs who fled, but the Jews, as you can see from that police report, the Jews were trying to encourage them to stay. Now, that wasn't always the case. There were instances where the Jews expelled Palestinians. They were a relatively small number of instances, and usually it wasn't for the purpose of ethnic cleansing, it was for strategic reasons. That is, there were times when the Palestinian community of Palestinian villages would end up behind Jewish lines, and the Jewish fighters couldn't risk being surrounded or having enemies behind them, and would force the Jews out of those particular, the Palestinians out of those particular villages. But that happened in a relatively small number of places involving a very small number of people. You hear another myth about the numbers, that there were 1 million Palestinians or 750,000 who were expelled, and that these were the only refugees from the Arab-Israeli conflict. There were actually no more than 650,000 Palestinian Arabs who became refugees, and the number was probably significantly lower. Ephraim Karsh, an Israeli historian, has gone village by village, and he came up with a number of something over 500,000, I believe. There was a report by the United Nations in September of 48 that found there were only 360,000. The CIA did its own estimate and found only 330,000. So the numbers were much smaller than what is bandied about by propagandists today. There were Jews who became refugees within Palestine and Israel, who actually were eligible for aid from the United Nations, but Israel took care of them. Over the next 14 years, hundreds of thousands, over 800,000 total, fled Arab states. You never hear anything about these refugees, but you can see that there were large numbers of Jews who lived for centuries in many of these Arab states, especially in places like Iran and Iraq. But they fled for a number of reasons. Some left just because they wanted to now live in a Jewish state. They were Zionists. Some were forced to leave. They were expelled from the countries. Zionism was made illegal in some of the countries. There were pogroms in some of these Arab countries. So over the course of these years, the Arab world and North Africa were practically denuded of Jewish populations. Another myth is that if we just solve the Palestinian question, then there will be peace in the Middle East. We'll have a messianic age. Well, if the Palestinians got a state tomorrow, if they declared themselves Zionists and they became a state, that wouldn't have anything to do with much of the violence in the region. It would not have anything to do with ending the civil wars in Yemen, in Libya. It wouldn't end the violence in Syria. It wouldn't put an end to the centuries-old conflict between Sunni and Shiite Muslims, the Iranian threats, or terrorism from extremist groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda. If there was a Palestinian state, it wouldn't mean there would be any fewer radical Islamists. Hamas has said they would never accept a Jewish state next to it. Hezbollah the same, and the Iranians. These are all extremist groups who will continue to fight whether Palestinians have independence or not, because they're in a war, they're in a clash of civilizations. I know there are a lot of people who don't like to hear this, but it's a reality that the radical Muslims are determined for world domination. They believe that Islam is the only way, that the world should all be under Islamic rule, and are going to continue to pursue that objective, whether Palestinians have a state or not. Israeli settlements are illegal and that the West Bank is occupied, or another popular myths. Jews, of course, have lived in Judea and Samaria for centuries. They have a historical presence. They didn't just show up in 1967. Some did move back in 1967 after they'd been expelled or killed by the Jordanians during the 48 War, or from 1929 and the massacres in Hebron. But Jews have lived in these areas for millennia. You hear all the time about the legality of the settlements. Most of the argument has to do with the UN's interpretation and the International Court of Justice, which is essentially an arm of the UN. These are really political bodies, not legal ones. They are mostly influenced by the political winds and the majorities that are anti-Israel. The fact is that you can't assume that Israel is occupying land that is something that they once were sovereign in, and Palestinians have never been sovereign in. There's a misunderstanding of the Fourth Geneva Convention, suggesting that if Israel, because Jews have settled in Judea and Samaria, this is a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, but this was something that was developed because of what the Nazis did to the Jews in World War II, and had no applicability to what Israel is doing in terms of civilians moving to another part of what is sovereign Jewish territory. The correct term is not occupation, it should be disputed territories. Both sides have a claim. The Palestinians do have a claim. I would argue it's not as strong as the Israeli claim, since Israel has had sovereignty for hundreds of years and the Palestinians never did. But a country can't occupy territory to which it has sovereign title, which Israel does. What about the Palestinians being offered a state? They've had multiple opportunities. The two-state solution is not something new, as I intimated earlier. You had it going back to 1937, when the British Peel Commission said there's this riot between Jews and Arabs. How do we solve this problem? Let's divide the land. Again, the Jews were reluctantly willing to accept what was a fraction of the Jewish homeland. The Arab states were not. 1947, we talked about the partition plan. Again, the Jews at the time were willing to accept a state that was much smaller than what had been the original Jewish homeland promised to them in the Balfour Declaration, but were willing to accept it. The Arab states were not. In 1979, the negotiations included the offer of autonomy to the Palestinians. Menachem Begin offered to give them a degree of self-rule. It was not a state, but had they accepted it, it would have been very difficult for Israel to have prevented the establishment of a state. And by the way, when you talk about settlements, at the time of the negotiations at Camp David, there were about 10,000 Jews living in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. Today, there are more than 500,000. If the Palestinians had accepted autonomy, the settlements would have stopped, or certainly not grown to the extent they have. And at each time that the Palestinians have rejected statehood, the result hasn't been helping them. It's been helping the growth of settlements. You had in 2000 the Camp David agreement, or the Camp David summit, where Ehud Barak offered a Palestinian state that looked something like this, that basically 96 to 97% of the West Bank was going to be a Palestinian state, and there was going to be a connection you can't see in this map to the Gaza Strip, which would also be part of the Palestinian state. And Arafat rejected the deal. Oh, sorry. In 2008, Prime Minister Olmert offered a similar deal, and he had about 30 meetings with Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, and like his predecessor Arafat, he also was refused to accept the offer of a state. And again, as I think I mentioned, one of the things you never hear anybody talk about is why it is that if the Palestinians deserve self-determination, and if they are so committed to independence, why is it that none of that was discussed for 19 years when Egypt controlled the Gaza Strip and Jordan controlled the West Bank? No one recognized. There was only two countries, Britain and Pakistan, I believe, that recognized their occupation. But there were no UN resolutions calling for a two-state solution and an end to Jordanian and Egyptian occupation. There were no protests on college campuses calling for a two-state solution and the end of these occupations. That all only happened after the Jews captured those areas. Why not a Palestinian state? Will it pose any danger to Israel? Well, there's an ideal scenario of having a democratic Palestinian state living peacefully next to Israel. The problem is that there are no democratic Arab states, that the Palestinians do not have a democracy. They have as their state religion in their draft constitution that it will be a Muslim state under Sharia law. The Palestinians have shown through their behavior that they are not willing to live in peace with Israel. And of course, the most dramatic example is what happened on October 7th. Yitzhak Rabin was not willing to agree to a Palestinian state either, even though he signed the Oslo Accords, and they were supposed to lead to a Palestinian state over the course of 5 years. He said in his last speech before his assassination that he only foresaw the Palestinians having what he called an entity, not a state, specifically ruled out a state, because of the fear that it would create a security threat to the state of Israel. Most important before October 7th was the disengagement precedent. Some of you may be old enough to remember that prior to 2005, you heard all the time that Israel should trade land for peace. That was the mantra. Trade land for peace. There was an organization, Peace Now, in Israel, would have hundreds of thousands of people rally for trading land for peace. Well, in 2005, Israel gave up the entire Gaza Strip. It evacuated every soldier and every citizen, all 9,000. And the Palestinians had the opportunity to create the infrastructure for a state. They could have lived in peace. They could have said, okay, finally, those Israelis are gone. Now we're going to focus on state building. They had all of the greenhouses that the settlers had left behind, a multi-million-dollar export industry. Instead of taking advantage of it, they set fire to all of the greenhouses or used them as Hamas training camps. Instead of using the billions of dollars in aid that they got to create a state and to move the refugees out of the refugee camps, they didn't spend $1 to build one house for one refugee. And they almost immediately began terror attacks against Israel. Long before October 7th, they were launching thousands of rockets into Israel. And the Israeli people saw this and said, this land for peace, we traded land and we got war, we got terrorism. And the entire Israeli body politic basically moved to the right. If this is why, if you wonder why Bibi Netanyahu has been able to win election after election and be the longest serving prime minister, the Israeli public saw him as the one who would ensure their security. Whether you believe it or not, or like Bibi or not, that was the political reality. And you didn't have Peace Now rallies anymore. You didn't have people talking about land for peace because this is what Israel saw. And this has only been exacerbated by October 7th, so that now you find very few Israelis who believe that they can make any territorial concessions to the Palestinians in expectation of peace. Another reason for the Israeli body politic being skeptical of any trade of land for peace is that the so-called moderates like Mahmoud Abbas in the West Bank have their own plan for the destruction of Israel. If you look at their symbols, you can see it's not a state living beside Israel. It's something very different. They have what the PLO regarded as the plan of stages. That is, they would say they're willing to accept a state in the 1967 borders, but that's only the first step toward the liberation of Palestine. And this is what their ultimate goal is. This isn't my invention. This is from the Palestinian Authority's website. This is the map that's in every single Palestinian Authority textbook. This is what kids learn. And when Israelis see this and realize that this is how the next generation of Palestinians and the previous generations are brought up, they are reasonably skeptical of the prospects for a peace agreement. Another of the popular myths is comparing Israel to South Africa. This is, again, a calumny that's easily disproved. You have the Declaration of Israel's Independence, which explicitly gave Arab citizens the same rights as Jewish citizens, committed to their full equality, respect for their religion. When 156,000 Arabs stayed in Israel at the time of its independence, they were granted the full rights in all areas except the army. The Arabs were, except for Druze and some other Arab volunteers, they weren't required to go to the army, but otherwise they had all of the same rights. And you find Arab citizens today in all walks of Israeli life. You find them as ambassadors and other government positions. They're on the Supreme Court. They're in all walks of life. What's the difference? This is what apartheid meant. This was racial segregation. Palestinians are not a race, so there's no segregation against them. Unlike in South Africa, Palestinians don't live in separate parts of the country. They're not prevented from having businesses or being in professions as same as Jews. They don't have to go to separate schools or beaches or drinking fountains. Uh, they don't have inferior services. And of course, they can vote. Not only can they vote in Israeli elections, but they are members of the Knesset. Now, the situation for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza are different because they're not citizens of Israel. Since they're not citizens, they're not entitled to the same rights as Israeli citizens, but they also are not under the control of Israel. The Palestinians and the Palestinian Authority are under the governing authority of Mahmoud Abbas and his parliament, to the extent that it's not just him. The fact that Palestinians in the West Bank don't have women's rights, gay rights, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, all of the freedoms that we associate with civil rights are denied the Palestinians by the Palestinians, not by the Israelis, because those rights are controlled by the Palestinian Authority. Now, I'm not here to tell you that Israeli society is perfect. It's not. There are inequalities. There's no question about that. There are differences, though, that are nothing like what you found in the apartheid system in South Africa. You know, the United States hasn't become perfect, and they eliminated all inequalities in over 250 years. There's no reason to think that Israel would have done it in less than 80 years. Israel's committing genocide in Gaza. This is something we hear over and over again. You have resolutions, you have investigations making these claims. What is genocide? It's very specific. It's the intention to destroy, wholly or partially, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Israel has expressed no intention to destroy anyone. When you talk about genocide, these are genocides where you add the 6 million Jews who were slaughtered in the Holocaust, the Cambodian genocide, the Ukrainian genocide, Armenian, Rwandan, hundreds of thousands, millions of people murdered because of their race or religion. These were genocides. Nothing like that is going on in Gaza. For one thing, Israel has been committed to coexistence. As we saw earlier, even though there's a conflict with the Palestinians, the population has grown from 156,000 in 1948 to 2.1 million. If Israel was interested in ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, there would be 0 Palestinians today. Same goes for the West Bank and Gaza Strip. At the time of the mandate, there were a little over 1 million Arabs in quote unquote Palestine. Today, there's 4.6 million. How is that possible if Israel was determined to ethnically cleanse or engage in genocide? Is it consistent with peace if you're interested in genocide? Why would Israelis be willing to entertain a Palestinian state in all of those opportunities I mentioned earlier if they were determined to engage in genocide? And would you consider these the actions of a genocidaire to give aid to the Palestinians in Gaza, to provide medical treatment, that Israel has given medical treatment to leaders of Hamas, including the mastermind of October 7th and their families? Today, 99% of the Gaza population is still alive. How is that genocide? Israel would have to be the most incompetent army in history if they left virtually the entire population intact if they were interested in genocide. And by the way, when you talk about the number of Palestinians who are killed, as you probably all know, that number comes from Hamas. They invent the number of how many are dead, and they never tell you that any terrorists are killed. Again, Israel has to be the most incompetent army in history. If you read the New York Times, the Washington Post, or just about any publication which just repeats the Hamas number, because they never mention that somewhere between 20 and 25,000 of the maybe 60 to 70,000 Palestinians who've died were terrorists. This is not to minimize the fact that many civilians have died. That gets us to the whole attack of October 7th, that you hear some people who want to justify it as a response to Israeli occupation, Israeli oppression over the decades. Well, again, how was this a reaction to occupation of Gaza? There wasn't a single Israeli in Gaza. There were no soldiers, there were no citizens since 2005. So what occupation were they reacting to? And why is it, no one seems to ask, that there are no Palestinian Christian terrorists? If it's all about the occupation and the persecution, Palestinian Christians live under the exact same conditions as Palestinian Muslims, and yet they do not become extremists. What would be a more reasonable reaction? Okay, let's grant that life for Palestinians is not ideal, that they live under difficult circumstances, that they may be persecuted, that in their view they are occupied. Well, does that justify murder, rape, and kidnapping of Israeli civilians? The only way that they are going to achieve their goals, if their goal is indeed peace, is to negotiate. Violence is never going to be a way to achieve any of their aims. Israel intentionally targets civilians is something we hear all the time. Well, war is hell. Civilians die. That's the nature of warfare. And Israel is fighting in a unique environment that few armies have had to cope with. That is a densely populated, small area where the civilians are being used as shields. Mosques, schools, hospitals have all been used as command centers and arsenals. There is no real civilian area. It's all been used by Hamas. Every building, you hear about the buildings they're destroyed. Every building had tunnel entrances or had weapons caches. You could hardly find any place that Hamas had not touched. And unfortunately, that made civilians, in some cases, collateral damage. But the IDF has done things that no other army in history has done to try to prevent civilian death. I mean, if Israel, again, was interested in targeting civilians, 99% of the population would not still be alive, unless they're the worst army in history. They're the only army that basically tells the enemy, hey, we're coming, move, get out of the way. The American army doesn't send warnings to the enemy, but the IDF actually makes phone calls to Palestinians. It sends them leaflets. It sends them texts. It created evacuation areas. It did everything you could possibly do to try to make it less likely that a civilian will be injured. No army has done anything like that, but Civilians have died. There's no question. When you bomb a building that has terrorists in it, sometimes there have been civilians as well. And it's a tragedy, but it would not have happened if the attack had not occurred on October 7th. And that if the Hamas had surrendered and returned the hostages any time in the last 2 years, the fighting would have stopped and the civilians would have been safe. And by the way, the civilians also would have been safe if Egypt had opened the gates to allow them to escape. There was no reason why the Palestinians had to be penned up in Gaza uh, in the line of fire. They could have gone into the Sinai, they could have gone to other places, but President Biden made a deal with the president of Egypt to basically confine Palestinians to Gaza, where they were stuck in the crossfire.
Mitchell, it appears the presentation was unshared. Could you load it up again, please?
Okay, let me see why. I'm not sure why it stopped. Okay, do you see boycott, divestment?
Indeed.
So another of the myths is that the boycott, divestment, sanctions, the BDS movement started with Palestinians who wanted to promote peace and justice, and that they're advocates of the two-state solution. Well, I'm not sure how many people are aware that the boycott actually began with the Arab League in 1945, before there was even a state of Israel, before there was partition. It was obvious from the beginning that the Arab states were engaged in an anti-Semitic campaign against the Jews because there was no state of Israel. The boycott, divestment, sanction movement is no different. It really emerged in a big way at the Conference Against Racism, ironically, in 2001 in South Africa, where the final statement of the conference basically laid out the plan that's been followed ever since, which is to try to isolate Israel in every conceivable way, diplomatically, economically, socially, culturally. And this has been the campaign now for almost 25 years. And it's had no impact on Israel, just as the Arab League boycott didn't change Israeli policy one iota. One of the things about the BDS campaign is it doesn't take into account the impact it has on Palestinians. It hasn't helped one Palestinian gain their independence or to improve their welfare at all, but it's hurt many of the Palestinians. One of the most dramatic examples was when the BDS focused on the SodaStream factory that was in the West Bank, and the factory closed and moved inside the borders of Israel. And a large number of Palestinians who worked there all lost their jobs. They were earning good salaries, much better than they can get in any jobs in the Palestinian Authority. But thanks to the BDS, they lost their jobs. Thankfully, many of them were hired back by the owner to work in Israel. But many Palestinians suffer the consequences and reap no benefits from the BDS movement. And that's because BDS is focused not on helping Palestinians in Palestine or in changing Israeli policy. It's completely focused on trying to get outsiders to pressure Israel to capitulate to their demands. And Israel feels no compulsion to sacrifice its security to make the BDS people happy. It's also harming many of the Israelis who are most active in the peace movement. The BDS campaign is focused on ending relationships with Israeli universities, which, like American universities, tend to be very liberal. And a lot of the professors are advocates for Palestinian rights, and they're the ones who are now being punished by the BDS movement by the effort to boycott them and isolate Israeli universities. As far as their goals, none of them are interested in a two-state solution. Omar Barghouti specifically has ruled it interest in accepting a Jewish state, and their goal is to destroy Israel. The myth about starvation in Gaza, that can get a little complicated about how you define starvation. There's technical ways of defining it, but let's remember that there wouldn't be any people hungry in Gaza if not for the attack on October 7th. Hamas prioritized their own goals over the welfare of the civilian population. The famine claims really all come from Hamas. Anyone who is in Gaza is basically operating under the auspices of Hamas. If you were to criticize Hamas, if you were to say there was no famine, if you were to say that civilians weren't being targeted, if you were to say anything that conflicted with the Hamas narrative, you would be at best expelled, but more likely arrested, tortured, or killed. You've seen that just in the last few weeks since the ceasefire in the areas where Hamas regained control, where they immediately began executing their rivals and critics. There's been massive amounts of aid that have gone into Gaza. Jose Andres, the restaurateur, served over 32 million meals. The GHF, the organization that Israel and the United States set up, served 187 million before it closed down to give way to the international organizations. COGAT, the organization, the Israeli organization that oversees the territories, has sent in millions of tons of food and aid. There hasn't been a shortage of aid, but much of it has been looted by Hamas, and much of the problem has to do with the delivery, that lots of aid has been sitting outside of Gaza often, or the mechanisms, the trucks that have been designated to deliver it have been looted or stopped from making their deliveries. So all of that has contributed to the hardships in Gaza. And there's no question people have been hungry, but there hasn't been a famine. And one evidence of it is you don't hear anybody talking about it now. Another of the myths popular on campus with the intersectional crowd is that Israel is a settler colonial state. This shows that you really don't know what colonialism is. This is not a land that Jews came to belonging to someone else. It's the land that they were forcefully expelled from and that they were returning to as their homeland. This is the antithesis, really, of colonialism. Colonial powers send people into third countries to extract their natural resources, their minerals, for the benefit of the original country. Jews came to their country. They're not extracting any resources from any other place except their own country. They do things that no colonizer has ever done. When you have colonized other countries, the imperialists didn't give up the territories willingly the way Israel has done. According to Resolution 242, Israel is supposed to withdraw from some territory, not all the territory, but some territory in exchange for peace. Israel has given up roughly 97% of all the territory it captured in the 1967 war. That's not something any colonizer has ever done in history. And as Harkavia said, nothing's further from colonialism than Jews coming to their homeland to become farmers and to live by their own work rather than to enslave the people, the inhabitants they find there, which is what colonialists historically have done. I'll stop there. There's a lot more myths and facts. You can find a lot of them in the book available from Amazon, and all the most recent ones, in addition to the classics, are in the Jewish Virtual Library. And I highly encourage you to go visit the new site and learn more about all of the facts. And I'll take any questions you may have. I'll try to answer them briefly as best I can.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Bart, for the insightful presentation. We have a little over 10 minutes to try to respond to some of the questions that were received. I'll start by the first one. I would like to ask Mitchell a question about the work of Israeli professor Ruth Kark regarding the Ottoman land law of 1858. Can we get the deeds to all of the land purchased before 1948 at the official Zionist archive in Jerusalem? Can we show the purchase agreements and deeds to the land bought by the Jewish agency? All of this could be compiled in a book. Your response?
I don't know. I'm not sure if someone has done that already. That would be a major undertaking, partly because it would also involve deeds in multiple languages, probably. There are probably some that were Turkish. There are probably some British, some going to the colonial days and mandate times. I don't think that's something I could do.
All right, next question. Why are influential people like former White House advisor Ben Rhodes still, according to the person, still spouting lies and misinformation about Israel? And why is the New York Times still giving these lies a platform?
Well, the New York Times has never met a critic of Israel it didn't love. I mean, the best way to get on the New York Times op-ed page is to be a Jew who's anti-Israel. If you're a Jew who's pro-Israel, your chances of getting in the New York Times are practically zero. Look, there are plenty of people who are critics of Israel for all sorts of reasons. If you want to read a great point-by-point refutation of Rhodes, that was done by what's his name? Help me, or I'm blanking on his name. We'll get it for you if you want to know. But
Who are you
there's a
referring
great.
to again?
I'm sorry.
Who did you refer to?
I can't remember his name. I'm blanking on it. Spencer.
Oh, Spencer.
I'm blanking on his first name. I got his last name. Anyway, Spencer, if you can look up, he's written a point-by-point refutation of
John Spencer.
Rhodes's op-ed, which was complete nonsense.
John Spencer is his name. Yeah, I got a question that somehow this magically disappeared. Maybe the person left in protest. It was something like, is there a possibility to do this discussion along with academics such as Ilan Pape and I forgot the name of the other scholar, but you kind of like get an understanding because
Look, there are Israeli professors and there are non-Israeli professors who have their own narratives that bear little resemblance to the facts. I usually don't like to engage with people who don't deal in facts. It's like Deborah Lipstadt, who would always say she would never debate a Holocaust denier because you don't debate people who don't uh, accept basic facts of history.
hmm yeah, Noam Chomsky was the other person, was the other name that was mentioned. But I assume that the answer is the same, right?
Yes.
All right, next question. If a Gazan Palestinian wants to travel internationally, what identity document does he or she carry?
A Palestinian wants to travel internationally.
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, if they live in the Palestinian Authority, they have a Palestinian Authority passport, don't they?
And in Gaza?
And in Gaza, yeah. If you're Palestinian with Israeli citizenship, then you have an Israeli passport.
Yeah. If I may intervene in this specific question, well, the problem, if you put the documentation issue aside, the Gazans are not allowed to leave unless they have foreign passports, in which case they appeal to the countries which they are citizens of. For example, at the beginning of the war, there were American Gazans, and they were able to escape at one point. Not at the beginning, by the way, but later on in the war. I'm not. Even if Hamas were to issue some kind of a document, I would very hardly believe that it would be legitimate anywhere because it's a recognized terrorist organization, at least in the West. And yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly. I assume that the Gazan population probably have old Palestinian Authority passports, or maybe there's some kind of a bureaucratic level of coordination which allows them to have to renew these passports somehow. But the fact of the matter is that effectively Gazans are not allowed to leave, not to Egypt and not to anywhere else, especially during this time of this war, unless there are special arrangements made for them. Beforehand, by the way, during non-war times, there was some kind of an arrangement in which I think that they would leave through Jordan or some of the other crossings. But at this point, they are not able to travel. And by the way, what the Israeli administration is claiming is that they should have the ability to leave. It's not like Israel intends to kick anybody out, but if they want to leave for whatever reason, and one can imagine there is a reason, if practically all of Gaza is a war zone, then they should be allowed to do so. Next question. Yeah, there were a couple of questions, technical questions regarding the webinars that we're hosting. So regarding the recording of this presentation, yes, as we do traditionally, there will be a recording of this presentation that will be available online. There was another affiliated question with regards to the Jewish Heritage Alliance webinars. They are also featured, but since they are the main hosts, it's on their YouTube channel, but you're able to access them as well through our website. So another good reason to visit our page. Let's see what else is there. Can you talk about the West Bank from the Palestinian point of view?
Can I talk about what from the Palestinian point of
West
view?
Bank it's a broad.
Oh, the West Bank from the Look, from the Palestinian point of view, the West Bank is only a part of what they want to be all of Palestine, that they consider all of what is now Israel to be part of Palestine, that they're under the administration of Israel, which limits their movements, places certain other limits on what they can do in terms of visiting Jerusalem or visiting other parts of the world, that because the transit points are controlled by Israel, that they believe that the settlers are impinging on their lives. Some of the settlers, as I'm sure everybody's read, are violent and have engaged in attacks on Palestinians. I think they've been getting away. The settlers have gotten away with some of those things, and Netanyahu's said he's going to crack down. We'll see. The Palestinians also are captives of their own leaders, that they have not been willing or able to overthrow the people who have been corruptly running their lives for decades now. You have Mahmoud Abbas, who's in his 20th year of his 4-year term as president. He's prevented there being any elections. In Gaza, Hamas ruled with an iron fist. If you're a Christian, you're persecuted by your Muslim neighbors in Hamas land or in Palestinian Authority. So You know, life is certainly not easy for Palestinians in most of the areas, and that's all the more reason why they, you would think, would want to find a way to reach a peace agreement with their Israeli neighbors.
And I'll ask a follow-up question on my behalf. And do you believe, Dr. Bard, there is a prospect for peace if there is a willingness to do so, given the situation on the ground?
I think that in the short run, there is no prospect for peace because you have extremists who are in control in both Gaza and the Palestinian Authority, that the reality of the two-state solution that people talk about, that map I showed earlier from the Camp David summit, assumes that more than 100,000 Jews would have to be evacuated from the West Bank. Those of you who remember what a agonizing decision and process it was to evacuate 9,000 people from Gaza, it would be exponentially more difficult to remove 100,000 Jews from their homes in Judea and Samaria. Some would be willing to move, no doubt, willingly if they were given compensation, but it's hard to imagine any Israeli government ordering that kind of evacuation. And that's what it would require if you were going to have a two-state solution like most people imagine. Now, the peace plan that President Trump put forward in his first term was actually the most rational from the perspective of land. That is, it recognized that Israel wasn't going to remove Jews from Judea and Samaria, and that the Palestinian state would basically have to be constructed around those settlements. And the Palestinians, of course, rejected that. But that was the only reasonable proposal that's been made that at least recognizes the fact that Israel's not going to remove hundreds of thousands of Jews from their homes. Is there prospect for peace in the longer run? Well, my answer is always tries to be optimistic. I look at it this way. In 1947, one of the British officials went to one of the Zionists and said, "Why did you let us bring this issue to the United Nations? Don't you know you'll never get a Jewish state unless the United States and the Soviet Union agree? That will never happen. It's never happened. It can't possibly happen." Well, for the first time in history, the US and the Soviet Union agreed on the partition. For 30 years, nudniks like me would talk to groups and say, the Arabs, they'll never make peace. No Arab leader, no Muslim leader can ever make peace with the Jewish state. And then Anwar Sadat went to Jerusalem. He made peace. 15 years later, you had Hussein. 25 years later, you had Abraham Accords. So I think the lesson is it may take 30 years, 50 years, but it is possible for there to be peace. But there has to be dramatic changes on the part of the Palestinians. You know, the way that what made peace with Egypt possible was that Anwar Sadat broke the psychological barrier. When he went to Jerusalem, even though the speech he gave to the Knesset, you can read on the website, his speech was very hard line. He didn't come over saying that he'd become a Zionist, but the fact that he was willing to speak to the Israeli people directly from their legislature shattered the psychological barrier to the notion that a Arab leader could make peace with the Jews. And the Palestinians have yet to do something like that. They haven't had a leader who is prepared to make that kind of psychological breakthrough. And also, as I think I mentioned, as long as the school system is teaching that the ultimate goal is the destruction of Israel, there's very little hope that the coming generation is going to change its attitude.
Well, let's keep our wave of optimism based on some of the historical precedents that you just mentioned. In any case, I want to introduce a few more concluding remarks, if you please. So please bear with us. So thank you, Dr. Bard, for the clear and deep informative presentation, and thank you all for joining us this evening. As we heard tonight, myths about the Arab-Israeli conflict are not just misunderstandings. They shape global opinion, influence policy debates, and fuel hostility toward Israel and the Jewish people. Confronting these distortions with documented history and factual clarity is essential if we are to foster a more informed and honest conversation about the Middle East. The work, of course, does not end here. By promoting education, historical accuracy, and critical thinking, we can push back against misinformation and ensure that the complex realities of this conflict are understood rather than oversimplified or misrepresented. Therefore, we encourage you to continue exploring the Jewish Virtual Library. By the way, I just put the address in case anybody doesn't know how to access the website. It doesn't have the address. I put the URL at the chat on the chat box for you for resources on Israel, Jewish history, and U.S. Middle East relations. As we reach the end of this year, please consider supporting our mission for efforts like this and many others. You'll find links in the chat box to our donation page. It was right at the top, along with the links to our respective social media platforms where you can stay connected with our work and future events. And with that, thank you again for being with us tonight. We look forward to welcoming you to our next JVL webinar as we continue to illuminate the issues shaping Israel, the Jewish world, and the broader Middle East. Thank you very
Thank you
much.
all for coming. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to leave the page open for a couple of minutes so you can access the links if you wish. Thank you and good night.
Peace.